In the relentless winters of the Middle Ages, when the cold cut like a freshly forged sword and the wind howled as if trying to unearth the darkest secrets of the forests, medieval women faced a challenge that was both a vital necessity and an epic feat: cooking for their families without turning into ice sculptures. Imagine a world without electricity, without central heating, without refrigerators or microwaves, where fire was the only refuge against cold and hunger. Medieval kitchens, far from being the warm and cozy spaces we know today, were true battlefields where ingenuity, endurance, and skill confronted the elements. In this tale, we will dive into how these women managed to prepare food during the harshest months of the year, battling bone-chilling temperatures, scarce resources, and the expectations of a society that depended on them to survive. Prepare for a journey to the past where every meal was a hard-won victory against winter, a testament to human resilience in a world where survival was a daily struggle, a constant dance between necessity and creativity. The setting where these women worked was hardly a refuge from the cold. Peasant homes, built with wood, adobe, or stone, had thatched roofs that, while picturesque in drawings, let icy air pass through as if it were an honored guest. Windows, if they existed, were small slits covered with cloth, hides, or, in rare cases, treated animal bladders to allow some light to filter through. Glass was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, so in most homes, the cold crept in mercilessly, turning the interior into an extension of the wintry landscape. Breath turned into clouds of vapor, as if you were exhaling in a glacial cave. The smoke from the central hearth, a fire pit on the floor, filled the air with an acrid smell, stinging the eyes while the women struggled to keep the flames alive. In castles or noble houses, kitchens were somewhat more advanced, with stone fireplaces and built-in ovens, but even there, the cold seeped through wall cracks, reminding everyone that winter respected no social rank. Cooks, wrapped in layers of coarse wool or linen clothing, moved quickly to avoid freezing, while the smoke and cold turned every task into a challenge requiring both physical strength and mental cunning. Fire was the beating heart of the medieval kitchen, but keeping it burning in winter was an odyssey worthy of an epic saga. Wood, the primary fuel, wasn't obtained with a snap of the fingers. During summer and autumn, families gathered wood, chopped it, dried it, and stored it in sheds or under makeshift roofs to protect it from rain and snow. In winter, when forests were blanketed in white and paths became treacherous, going out to fetch more wood was a dangerous mission, akin to facing a dragon with a mere stick. Women, like strategists of an invisible army, rationed every log with military precision, knowing that a mismanaged fire could leave them without heat or food. In peasant homes, the central hearth served to cook, heat, and sometimes dry clothes, forcing women to master a delicate balance. A fire too large burned through wood quickly, but one too weak couldn't cook a stew or keep the cold at bay. In castles, kitchens were often separate, in large, poorly ventilated rooms where cold gathered in corners like an unwelcome guest, and cooks had to work swiftly to avoid freezing. In some cases, women used dry branches, dried dung, or even peat as emergency fuel, but these produced more smoke and less heat, further complicating the task and filling the air with an often unbearable smell. The food available in winter was another puzzle requiring ingenuity and planning. Without supermarkets or imported exotic fruits, women relied on what they had carefully stored during the warmer months. Granaries and pantries were fortresses holding grains, wheat, barley, rye, dried legumes like lentils, fava beans, or peas, and root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, or cabbages. Fresh vegetables were practically a myth in winter, except for these hardy roots, stored in cool cellars or buried in sand to preserve them. Meat, when available, was usually salted or smoked, as animals were slaughtered in autumn to avoid the cost of feeding them through winter. Pork was the king of meats, transformed into bacon, hams, or sausages, but even in humble homes, a piece of meat was a treasure used sparingly, often just to flavor a stew. In coastal areas, salted or dried fish was a vital resource, but inland, it was a rarity only the wealthy could afford, sometimes transported from distant ports at exorbitant cost. In poorer regions, women resorted to scraps like bones, fat, or even boiled hides to add flavor, squeezing every resource to its last drop. In some cases, women gathered edible wild herbs like nettles or dandelions, which withstood the cold and could add a touch of freshness to dishes. Preparing these foods in a freezing environment required not only culinary skill but a physical endurance that would seem superhuman today. Medieval women had no kitchen gloves or modern aprons. Their hands, reddened and cracked by the cold, handled heavy iron or ceramic pots over the fire. Imagine crouching by a hearth, smoke stinging your eyes like sprinkled pepper, while stirring a soup that takes hours to cook because dried grains are more stubborn than an ox. Water, an essential ingredient, wasn't easy to obtain. It had to be fetched from a well or river, which meant walking through icy paths with buckets that sometimes arrived home frozen. In colder regions like Scandinavia or the Scottish Highlands, water could turn to ice on the way, requiring it to be melted by the fire, consuming more wood. All this while wearing layers of rough woolen clothing that protected against the cold but became heavy and damp if you ventured outside. In some cases, women used blankets or old hides to cover their shoulders while working, but these weren't always enough to keep warm. In colder areas, some wrapped their hands in rags to protect them from the icy metal of pots, though this made precise movements harder. In the poorest homes, women sometimes wrapped their feet in straw or old rags to create an improvised barrier against the frozen floor. Medieval cooking wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was an act of creativity under pressure. Women stretched the available ingredients to their limits, combining them to create dishes that were nutritious and, hopefully, appetizing. Stews and soups were the kings of winter, as they could be cooked slowly, make use of scraps, and keep everyone warm. A typical pot might include barley, turnips, a handful of dried herbs, and, if the day was generous, a piece of bacon or a bone for flavor. Exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, or ginger were a luxury reserved for nobles, but local herbs, thyme, rosemary, sage, parsley, were the soul of peasant cooking, added with precision to transform a monotonous dish into something uplifting. In wealthy homes, cooks could experiment, preparing meat pies with crispy dough layers or dishes with dried fruits like figs, plums, or raisins, which were a delicacy in the cold months. In poorer homes, creativity shone in stretching a handful of lentils or a single turnip to feed an entire family, sometimes adding clean ashes to thicken a broth or grinding bones to extract every last bit of flavor. In some regions, women used techniques like adding watered-down beer or homemade vinegar to give stews a distinctive touch, creating complex flavors with limited resources. Bread, another staple of the medieval diet, was a task that could break anyone's back. Grinding grain at home with a mortar or taking it to a communal mill was just the beginning. Dough was kneaded by hand, often on cold boards that numbed fingers. In winter, natural yeast was finicky, as the cold slowed fermentation. Women sought the warmest corner of the house, usually near the fire, to let the dough rise, but even then, the process could take hours. Sometimes, they wrapped the dough in blankets or placed it near embers to speed fermentation, but this required constant vigilance to prevent burning. The result was dense, rustic bread, often mixed with rye or oats to stretch the wheat, eaten with whatever was available. A bit of hard cheese, a watery soup, or, on the worst days, alone. In some regions, women added herbs or seeds to the bread for flavor, like poppy seeds, fennel, or even ashes of burnt herbs, creating small variations that made each loaf unique. In poorer homes, bread was sometimes mixed with bran or even ground tree bark during times of famine, a desperate practice reflecting the harshness of winter. The cold also shaped the social dynamics of the kitchen. In peasant homes, cooking was a collective effort. Women of the family, along with daughters, nieces, or neighbors, worked side by side, sharing tasks and culinary secrets. Around the fire, while stirring a stew or kneading bread, they told stories, shared gossip, or sang songs, turning the kitchen into a refuge against winter's isolation. These conversations not only alleviated monotony but also strengthened community bonds, as women exchanged tips on stretching a stew or preserving a turnip for a few extra weeks. In castles, cooks were often servants working under the strict gaze of a housekeeper or head cook. These women followed recipes that could be surprisingly elaborate, especially for banquets, but the cold was an equalizer. Whether you were a peasant or a lord's servant, winter forced you to move quickly, plan carefully, and keep the fire burning at all costs. At noble banquets, cooks had to balance the need to impress with the scarcity of ingredients, creating dishes that appeared abundant despite being carefully rationed, like decorated meat pies or stews enriched with a touch of wine or rare spices. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I've left a book in the description that dives deeper. The clothing women wore while cooking was hardly a shield against the cold. Layers of wool and linen offered some protection but quickly became soaked if they had to fetch water or wood. Drying them by the fire was another task, and there wasn't always time to do it properly. Boots, if they had them, were made of hardened leather, which didn't always keep feet warm or dry. In colder regions like Scandinavia or the Alps, some women used animal hides to cover themselves, but these were a scarce and expensive resource, reserved for families who could afford them. In many cases, constant movement, kneading, chopping, stirring, was the only way to generate body heat. Women learned to work quickly, not just to finish tasks but to avoid freezing in the process. In poorer homes, they sometimes wrapped their feet in rags or straw for extra insulation, though this wasn't always comfortable or effective. In some cases, women sewed old clothes together to create an improvised shawl, offering some protection against the cold but hindering movement. In colder regions, some applied animal fat to their hands or feet to protect their skin from extreme cold, a practice that, while effective, wasn't exactly pleasant. Food storage was an art that women mastered with near-scientific precision. Without refrigeration, preservation was key to surviving winter. Salting, smoking, and drying were essential techniques, but each required time, knowledge, and vigilance. Meat was cured with salt and hung in cool, dry places, but winter's humidity could turn a ham moldy if not checked regularly. Grains were stored in sacks or barrels but had to be protected from mice, insects, and dampness. Women inspected their pantries like sentinels, knowing a single mistake could cost weeks of food. Some used clever tricks, like burying turnips, parsnips, or apples in sand or straw to keep them fresh for months. In coastal areas, dried or salted fish was a vital resource, but it required a laborious process of cleaning, cutting, and drying that women performed with a skill that would seem heroic today. In some regions, like Northern Europe, women also used peat or ashes to preserve tubers, creating a barrier against moisture and rodents. In Mediterranean areas, sun-drying fruits like figs or grapes before winter was common, requiring days of work under the autumn sun. In Eastern Europe, fermentation was another key technique, especially for cabbage, which became sauerkraut, a food that not only lasted months but also added a distinctive flavor to dishes. Water, a resource we take for granted today, was another obstacle. In rural areas, wells could freeze, and rivers were often too far or dangerous to reach in winter. Women learned to melt snow or ice by the fire, but this consumed time and wood, two resources that were never abundant. In poorer homes, water was sometimes reused. Yes, water used to wash vegetables might end up in the soup, not exactly a modern hygiene standard, but survival didn't allow for delicacies. In castles, kitchens sometimes had access to cisterns or rudimentary plumbing, but even there, water arrived cold, and heating it was another task adding to the daily burden. In some cases, women used large pots to keep a constant supply of warm water, but this meant more work to keep the fire going. In colder regions, women sometimes broke ice from buckets with stones or improvised tools, a process that could be exhausting and dangerous. In some communities, women organized shifts to fetch water in groups, sharing the burden of walking icy paths and ensuring every family had enough water to cook and drink. Kitchen tools reflected the era's harshness. Iron or ceramic pots were heavy and hard to handle, especially with numb hands. Knives, essential for cutting everything from turnips to bacon, weren't always sharp, and a poorly cut piece could waste a precious ingredient. Women learned to use them with precision, as every bit of food counted in winter. Mortars, wooden boards, and spits were common, but there were no appliances to lighten the load. Everything was done by hand, from grinding spices to crushing grains or chopping wood. In noble homes, cooks might have specialized tools like pie molds or meat hooks, but even then, the work was physically exhausting. In some regions, women crafted their own tools, like wooden spoons or makeshift tongs, using scraps of wood or bone, adding another layer to their already long days. Sometimes, tools broke from constant use or cold, and women had to repair them with improvised techniques, like tying a broken handle with rope or reinforcing a cracked pot with clay. In rural areas with limited access to blacksmiths, women sometimes sharpened their own knives with river stones, a process requiring patience and skill. The role of women in the medieval kitchen also carried cultural and symbolic weight. In villages, a woman who could prepare a hearty stew with the scarcest ingredients was seen as a community pillar. Her recipes, passed down orally from mothers to daughters, were as valuable as any inheritance. In castles, cooks had to impress lords and their guests, preparing banquets that, while simple by our standards, were a display of skill. A well-executed meat pie with a crisp crust and juicy filling or a spiced stew could be a source of pride, even in the darkest winter days. Yet, this work was rarely celebrated in historical chronicles, which preferred to exalt the deeds of knights and kings. But without women in the kitchen, no army would have marched, and no court would have shone. In villages, women sometimes shared their knowledge with neighbors, creating a support network essential for community survival. Older women taught younger ones not just recipes but tricks for preserving food or managing fire, ensuring knowledge passed through generations. Hey, if you're enjoying this topic and want to keep learning about medieval life, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll find more content like this, with fascinating details and a bit of humor to keep you from freezing with boredom. Illnesses were another challenge. Winter brought colds, fevers, and lung ailments, worsened by the constant smoke from hearths. Women, exposed to cold and stale air, weren't immune but rarely could afford to rest. If the main cook fell ill, a daughter, neighbor, or even a child took her place, as hunger didn't wait. Herbal infusions, chamomile, mint, sage, were common to relieve symptoms, and women prepared them not just for themselves but for the whole family. This rudimentary herbal knowledge was another example of practical wisdom passed down through generations. In some cases, women mixed herbs with honey or watered-down beer to make remedies more palatable, especially for children who didn't always take kindly to bitter infusions. In regions with limited herb access, women used substitutes like willow bark, believed to relieve pain, or dried chicory roots to soothe fevers. In some homes, women also made ointments with animal fat and herbs to treat burns or cracked skin, a common need in an environment where cold and fire were constant companions. In urban areas, women working in inns or taverns faced added pressure, satisfying customers. These cooks not only fed their families but also travelers, merchants, and locals seeking a hot meal after a day on icy roads. Taverns offered stews, breads, and, at best, watered-down beer. But in winter, the demand for hot, tasty food was high. A good dish could mean a decent tip, a bad one, a grumpy customer who didn't return. In these kitchens, the fire burned almost all day, requiring a constant wood supply and impeccable organization to keep chaos at bay. Tavern cooks also had to be experts at stretching ingredients, as customers expected generous portions at low prices, and a miscalculation could ruin the business. In some taverns, women also brewed beer or mead, a process requiring fermentation of grains or honey in cold conditions, adding another layer of complexity to their work. In larger cities like London or Paris, women sometimes worked in teams, dividing tasks between food preparation, brewing, and serving customers, creating an efficient system to maximize available resources. Herbs and spices deserve their own chapter. While exotic spices like pepper, ginger, or saffron were a luxury for the rich, local herbs were the soul of medieval cooking. During summer, women gathered thyme, rosemary, parsley, oregano, and sage, drying them carefully for winter use. These herbs not only added flavor but were believed to have medicinal properties. Rosemary eased muscle pain, sage helped with throat infections, and parsley soothed the stomach. In noble homes, spices were a status symbol, and cooks handled them like jewels, measuring each pinch precisely. A stew with a touch of pepper could impress a guest, but wasting it was a crime that could cost a cook her job. In peasant homes, women sometimes improvised with substitutes like fennel seeds, dried berries, or even ashes of certain plants to mimic the flavors of expensive spices. In some regions, like Northern Europe, women used dried seaweed or tree bark to add flavor, a trick learned from previous generations. In the South, like Mediterranean regions, women sometimes used herb-infused olive oil to give dishes a special touch, though oil was a luxury not always available. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I've left a book in the description that dives deeper. Time management was another crucial aspect. Without clocks, women followed the rhythm of the sun and the household's needs. In winter, short days forced them to make the most of every minute of light. Heavy tasks like grinding grain or kneading were done at dawn, while stews could simmer slowly throughout the day, freeing up time for other chores like sewing, childcare, or tool repair. During long nights, the kitchen became the heart of the home, where families gathered around the fire to eat, tell stories, or simply stay warm. These evenings, though marked by cold, were moments of connection in a world that could feel isolated and hostile. In some communities, women organized small celebrations, like preparing oatcakes with honey or dried fruits, to break the monotony and remind everyone that spring, though distant, would eventually arrive. These celebrations often coincided with religious holidays like St. Nicholas, Epiphany, or St. John, offering an excuse to share food and hope. In some homes, women marked these occasions with small rituals, like lighting an extra candle or decorating a loaf with religious symbols, fostering a sense of community and purpose. The psychological impact of winter shouldn't be overlooked. The cold months were dark, not just from lack of light but from isolation. Snowstorms could trap families indoors for days, and the monotony of the diet, always turnips, barley, and little else, could sap morale. Women, as guardians of the kitchen, played a key role in keeping spirits high. A well-seasoned stew, freshly baked bread, or a rare sweet made with honey or dried fruit could be a ray of light on a gray day. In some communities, women organized small winter celebrations, like making oatcakes with honey, to break the routine and remind everyone that spring would come. These small culinary victories were a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, life could find a way to flourish. In some cases, women told stories of past summers, sang traditional songs, or even invented games around the fire, creating an atmosphere of hope to counter winter's harshness. In villages, these gatherings often included multiple families, sharing food and warmth to combat isolation. In monasteries and convents, women also played a vital role in the kitchen. Nuns, though dedicated to prayer, weren't exempt from practical tasks. In winter, monastic kitchens followed strict rules, especially during periods like Lent, which often coincided with the cold months. They prepared legume soups, unleavened breads, and, in some cases, fish broths for fasting days. These kitchens were warmer than peasant homes, thanks to stone walls and well-built ovens, but the work was still arduous. Novices, in particular, learned to cook under the supervision of older nuns, memorizing recipes and techniques that blended practicality with devotion. In some convents, nuns also brewed beers or medicinal liqueurs, using herbs and honey to create drinks that helped fight cold and illness. These beverages were often shared with the local community, strengthening ties between the monastery and nearby villages. In some cases, nuns also prepared special sweets for religious holidays, like honey or nut cakes, distributed as acts of charity to the needy. Regional differences also shaped winter cooking. In Northern Europe, like Scandinavia, women relied heavily on dried fish and oat porridge, which held up well in extreme cold. In the South, like the Mediterranean, winters were milder, but the scarcity of fresh vegetables was still a problem, and women turned to olives, dried figs, and chickpeas. In the Scottish Highlands or the Alps, kitchens focused on smoked meats and tubers, while in the plains of France or England, lentil and barley stews were the norm. Each region had its tricks, favorite herbs, and ways of stretching resources, but the challenge was the same: surviving winter with what was available. For example, in the Baltic regions, women used dried berries to add sweetness to porridge, while in southern Italy, olive oil, when available, was a luxury that transformed a simple dish into something special. In mountainous areas like the Pyrenees, women used grated hard cheese to flavor soups, while in Eastern Europe's plains, fermented cabbage was a common complement to stews. In coastal areas, dried fish was ground and mixed into porridges or soups, creating dishes that were both nutritious and long-lasting. If this journey to the past is fascinating you, don't miss more content like this. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and discover more medieval life stories with a touch of humor to keep you hooked. Superstitions also played a role in medieval cooking. In many communities, certain foods or practices were believed to bring good luck or protect against evil. For example, adding sage to a stew was thought to ward off illness, while accidentally spilling salt could bring bad luck. Women, as keepers of these traditions, incorporated these rituals into their daily work, blending pragmatism with a touch of mysticism. In some homes, dried herbs were hung over the kitchen door to keep evil spirits at bay, a practice combining the need to preserve food with supernatural beliefs. In other regions, cutting a loaf into a cross shape before baking was believed to protect the family from bad luck, a tradition that persists in some cultures. In some areas, women avoided cooking certain foods, like garlic, during full moon nights for fear of attracting misfortune, though these practices varied by region and community. In some rural communities, offering a piece of bread to travelers in winter was believed to bring good fortune to the household, a gesture of hospitality that also strengthened community ties. The market, though limited in winter, was another space where women made their mark. In cities, some women sold breads, cheeses, or stews at makeshift stalls, braving the cold to earn a few coins. These vendors were experts at stretching their products, offering small but tasty portions to attract customers. In villages, bartering was more common, with women trading a loaf for a handful of herbs or a piece of bacon for a sack of barley. This trade, though modest, connected communities and shared resources in times of scarcity. In some cases, women also sold dried herbs or medicinal infusions, leveraging their herbal knowledge for extra income. At local fairs, often tied to religious holidays, women offered products like rye bread, homemade beer, or honey sweets, attracting travelers and locals alike. In larger cities like London or Paris, women sometimes formed informal guilds to protect their commercial interests, sharing resources and strategies to survive winter. In some cases, these women negotiated with merchants to obtain rare ingredients like spices or dried fruits, which they could resell at a higher price. Medieval cooking was also shaped by religious holidays, which added rhythm to winter. Christmas, Advent, or Lent dictated what could be eaten and when. At Christmas, families who could afford it prepared special dishes like meat pies or honey sweets, though in poor homes, this might mean just a slightly more generous stew. During Lent, restrictions were stricter, and women had to be even more creative to prepare meals without meat or dairy. In monasteries, these rules were followed to the letter, but even in peasant homes, religion shaped the diet, adding another layer of complexity to women's work. For example, in some homes, women prepared fish broths or legume soups during fasting days, using herbs to compensate for the lack of rich ingredients. In some regions, like southern France, women made special breads for holidays, often marked with religious symbols like a cross or star to honor the occasion. In Northern Europe, women prepared special porridges with dried berries or honey for Christmas, creating a moment of joy amid scarcity. Preservation techniques varied by region and available resources. In Northern Europe, smoking was common, especially for fish and meats. Women built small smokehouses in their homes or used chimneys to hang strips of meat or fish, letting the smoke infuse flavor and protect against spoilage. In the South, brining, a mixture of water, salt, and sometimes vinegar, was more common, especially for preserving vegetables like cabbages or cucumbers. In regions like the Scottish Highlands, women buried tubers in pits filled with straw or peat, creating a natural refrigerator that kept food fresh for months. In Baltic areas, women used ashes or sand to protect grains from moisture, while in the Mediterranean, sun-drying fruits like figs or grapes was common before winter. In some communities, women also used fermentation to preserve foods, like fermented cabbage in Eastern Europe, which not only lasted months but added a distinctive flavor to dishes. In coastal areas, women sometimes used seaweed to wrap fish or meat, a technique that helped preserve food and added a unique flavor. Recipes also reflected regional diversity. In England, a typical stew might include barley, turnips, and a bit of bacon, seasoned with herbs like parsley or thyme. In France, lentils and parsnips were the stars, often cooked with a pork bone for flavor. In Scandinavia, oat or rye porridge was a staple, sometimes mixed with ground dried fish for protein. In the Mediterranean, dried chickpeas were soaked for hours before cooking in a thick broth with olives or dried figs. Each region had its tricks. In parts of Germany, women added watered-down beer to stews for a bitter touch, while in Italy, olive oil, when available, was a luxury that transformed a simple dish into something special. In mountainous areas like the Pyrenees, women used grated hard cheese to flavor soups, while in Eastern Europe's plains, fermented cabbage was a common complement to stews. In coastal areas, dried fish was ground and mixed into porridges or soups, creating dishes that were both nutritious and long-lasting. In southern Spain, Arab influences introduced ingredients like rice or almonds, which women adapted to winter stews when available. Winter food trade was limited but not non-existent. In cities, winter markets offered grains, dried legumes, and, in some cases, hard cheeses that withstood the cold. Women selling at these markets were skilled negotiators, offering their products with a mix of cunning and charm. In villages, bartering was more common, with women trading a loaf for a handful of herbs or a piece of bacon for a sack of barley. This exchange not only diversified the diet but also strengthened community ties in a time when isolation could be overwhelming. In some regions, women also participated in local fairs, selling products like rye bread, homemade beer, or honey sweets, leveraging religious holidays to attract more customers. In larger cities like London or Paris, women sometimes formed informal guilds to protect their commercial interests, sharing resources and strategies to survive winter. In some cases, these women negotiated with merchants traveling trade routes, like those of the Hanseatic League, to obtain rare ingredients like spices or dried fruits, which they could resell at a higher price. Culinary superstitions also added a touch of magic to the kitchen. In some regions, cutting a loaf into a cross shape before baking was believed to protect the family from bad luck. In others, spilling salt was a bad omen, and women sprinkled some into the fire to counteract it. These beliefs, though curious today, were a way to find order in an unpredictable world. Women, as guardians of these traditions, wove them into their routines, blending the practical with the mystical. In some homes, it was believed that a stew prepared during a storm brought good luck, as long as it was stirred clockwise, a practice combining superstition with the need to keep food from sticking. In other regions, women avoided cooking certain foods, like garlic, during full moon nights for fear of attracting misfortune, though these practices varied by region and community. In some rural communities, offering a piece of bread to travelers in winter was believed to bring good fortune to the household, a gesture of hospitality that also strengthened community ties. In summary, medieval women who cooked in winter were far more than cooks. They were strategists who rationed wood and food with military precision, artists who transformed scarce ingredients into dishes that warmed body and soul, and pillars of their communities who kept everyone alive in the darkest months. With rudimentary tools, freezing temperatures, and limited resources, they demonstrated resilience and creativity that deserve celebration. Their work, though invisible in grand historical chronicles, was the spark that kept the flame of medieval life burning, even when winter seemed determined to snuff it out.